Welcome to Force Multiplier. I'm your host, Jonathan Ballin. Most people call me JB, and I'm a technologist and business leader at Intel focused on how advances in technology can create inflection points that disrupt conventional norms, create economic and societal value, and in the process, reshape the human experience, hopefully for the better. A force multiplier is intelligence or technology that can give you an advantage. And in this program, we dive into the edge of technology innovation and at the same time give you an inside edge and sharp insights to help you navigate this changing landscape. Today's program, in this episode, we're going to focus on the accelerated adoption of technology in today's chaotic and uncertain environment. And as many companies shift to remote workforce management and accelerate their adoption of digital technologies, we thought we would talk about how digital transformation is achieved under these circumstances, but also talk about how product companies, technology product companies themselves, need to rethink perhaps how they get products to market at scale. And there's no better person in the industry to have a conversation with on this topic than Geoffrey Moore, my honored guest today, who if you don't know, is a bit of a celebrity in Silicon Valley. Jeff is the author of many books on how companies can successfully innovate with technology at speed and scale. He's one of very few people that has had a long-standing and trusted relationship with some of high-tech's most notable CEOs, people like John Chambers and Satya Nadella, Mark Benioff, and many others. And Jeff is famous, amongst many things, for the technology adoption lifecycle, also known as the Chasm model, as well as the core context exercise, the zone to win framework, and many tools that are all interrelated into a toolkit to help companies really accelerate the adoption of technology into the market. And what's amazing about Jeff's models is that they're simple, but they're incredibly powerful and effective and adopted across many businesses at Intel, where I work. And so I'm delighted to have Jeff with us here today. Jeff, thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, JB. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. You know, I thought maybe for some of our viewers that are unfamiliar with crossing the chasm or the technology adoption lifecycle, that maybe we could just start with, a crash course in the model itself. And it's, you and I are not strangers. We've known each other for quite a long time. And the last time we did this was 10 years ago. I don't think people knew the word podcast at that time, but we were doing it. And I asked you then what started your passion, right? You've built a career. It's been 30 years talking about how companies need to think about getting an innovation to a degree of scale. And I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. We actually have a clip from that podcast from 10 years ago.
Okay.
And here's how you answered the question then.
Okay.
A functional organization is extremely good at achieving operational excellence, but it's not good at the cross-functional work of absorbing and championing a new innovation. And yet you didn't want to abandon your operational excellence capabilities. And everybody had figured out the first zone, the $0 to $10 million zone, the skunkworks zone. Most corporations are pretty good at that, actually. But it was this next zone of 10 million to 100 million, where you weren't the new kid on the block anymore, but you were still subscale for the operational model. And so if you took these businesses between 10 and 100 million dollars and said, well, look, just use the sales force, use the services group, use the marketing, it doesn't work. They really do need to have their own vertically integrated sort of cocoon-like world in order to get to scale.
Okay. By the way, we're both looking pretty good. I'm feeling okay.
You look exactly the same. I'm a little
Well, notice
aged.
that we're dressed. This is the new business casual that we're both wearing.
This is it. I mean, I was wearing sport coats and collared shirts. Who does that anymore? You know what's so amazing about that? Watching that now is you were exactly right then, and you're still right. And I think one of the things that you said in that interview is, as long as we have the human experience and we are social animals, the technology adoption life cycle will ring true, because it's fundamentally a behavioral framework amongst many other things. And so, what I thought we could do is talk about it in today's context, right? So, whether it's the pandemic or it's racial inequality, there's a lot of things right now that are changing how people are thinking about developing products. They're thinking about how do they develop them in this workforce constrained way, how they can do it in a way that's very inclusive and eliminates bias. And then, of course, there's the consumers of technology, many of which have been caught not ready, right, for this catalyst, right, this catalyst of crisis. And so I thought we'd just maybe spend some time today talking about those things and get your view on lessons and things that you're observing that we can all benefit from.
Well, let's put the framework kind of in place. And basically, it comes from the fact that different personas respond to this disruptive innovation in different ways. And there's a guy named Everett Rogers who did the original work way back in the 1950s, and he identified 5 personas. And they kind of go in a sequence. So the first persona is, for tech, we call them the technology enthusiast, and they're interested in the actual mechanics of the disruption. Like if it was the COVID virus, they want to know, well, how does the receptor work, and what cells does it attack, and that kind of stuff. And if it's a technology thing, though, well, how does your Internet of Things technology work, JB, and how does it fit in with the edge computing, with the core computing, blah blah blah. So those folks are kind of at the very forefront of any disruption. Whatever the disruption is, they're interested in understanding its mechanics. The next group, we call the visionaries, are the ones who go, you know what, this is going to change things. And if we kind of act now, we could be a first mover in the new normal. And as a result, we could have a competitive advantage. And so the visionaries are continually trying to project out a possible future. There's not enough data, so it's really more of an act of imagination, and then to act on it. We've celebrated visionaries all our lives. Steve Jobs with the iPod and the iPhone is kind of a classic example of that. He was the person who kind of saw where it could go. Those two groups together create the first phase of any adoption life cycle, which is, we called it the early market. And it's a place where people get together, people who believe what you believe, and you kind of have a meeting of the minds. And then there's this thing we ended up calling the chasm, because everybody else is going, there's not enough data, there's not enough proof points. I mean, really? Are you really going to take a chance here? And so we're curious and we're interested. But by the way, we don't really need to know how the COVID virus works. What we really want to know is, when's there a vaccine, right? And so that group we called the pragmatists. And the pragmatists were going, this is going to be the future, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. On the other hand, I don't want to fall behind. So it's sort of like a junior high dance problem. Like, I'm going to go when you're going to go. Are you going yet? I don't know. And that created the chasm, which was like, okay, I'll go when you go. Well, you're not going yet. Well, neither am I. Okay. It also created an effect we called, later on in the life cycle, we called the tornado, which was, you're going? Oh my God. Okay, me too. And so you have this weird thing in technology.
They call that the FOMO. This generation calls that the FOMO.
The FOMO.
Hurricane.
Yeah, fear of missing out. Exactly. It's a FOMO phenomenon. Exactly. So we go from no to FOMO.
Right.
And so this jerky development in response to a disruption of no, go. And then once you do go, then there's a fourth group of people who are going, well, God, do we really have to? I just was getting used to the old thing. Can't I go back to the old normal? Do we have to really go to a new normal? And then eventually they kind of capitulate and we go forward, and then it's no longer disruptive. Now the disruption's been absorbed. The problem that created for vendors was how do you get from no to FOMO when nobody wants to go out on the dance floor? And so we identified this strategy we called crossing the chasm. And the idea was target pragmatists who are in pain, who are under real duress, who normally would wait to see more data, but frankly, they're in such trouble, they're willing to take a chance, but not because they believe in the future, and not because they want to be a first mover, and not for competitive advantage, but to correct some problem that's becoming increasingly distressing. And what the vendor had to learn to do then, which was so hard for high-tech vendors, was to take this broad platform technology capability and zero it right down on the problem that pragmatist cohort was facing. We called it the use case, and just nail the use case. And once you got over that use case hump and you got the first pragmatist going, then you kind of have adjacent pragmatists saying, "We see it works. You can come in, and then eventually you got to the FOMOs." But that was the game.
So it would seem like, so maybe let me test this theory. So is it true that that something can catalyze the acceleration of that entire process? And for example, right now, every company has to be able to support digital communications over video. Some may have had a foundation of IT capability in place in order to support something like Zoom or WebEx, Microsoft Teams or Skype, and others maybe have caught flat-footed. Do you think that for companies that aren't prepared or that maybe are technology deniers, this can potentially be an existential threat to them if they don't embrace technology?
You bet. My way of putting what you just said is it creates a lot of cohorts in the pragmatist in pain category. In other words, pragmatists who otherwise have been waiting, we'll take our time. They all ran to the edge of the chasm because it was like, we have to work from home next week, and we're not prepared. And what they were turning to vendors to say, and this is why I think Zoom was so successful, you need to take this problem off my plate right now. And if you will, whatever the hell it is, I'll use it. And so that's what crises do. They create pragmatists in pain who normally would wait, but are now deferring waiting because it's actually worse. Normally they wait because they don't want to take the risk of jumping in, but now the risk of staying out is greater than the risk of jumping in. And so, yeah, it does accelerate change.
And there's probably no going back, right?
It's really interesting. Like you hear a lot of, I've been on a lot of conferences over the last 12 weeks about, well, what about the new normal versus the old normal? And, what I'm thinking is there may be industries where the new normal will look a lot like the old normal. I'm kind of hoping that restaurants will kind of go back to an old normal. That's my hope for them. Let me just turn that little guy off.
Is that the old normal calling?
Yeah, that was the old normal calling. So my hope is that restaurants will be able to go back to the old normal. My hope is that shopping malls, to some degree, will be able to go back to the old normal. Swimming pools, sports stadiums, whatever. But it's pretty clear that for a whole bunch of things, that the new normal is going to be different. And part of that, by the way, is we've learned from this work from home experience. There's a whole class of interrelationships that actually work better digitally than they do in person. And certainly if you factor in driving there or flying there, you're going, wow, this is sort of a Zoom first rhythm, I think, that's going to be part of the new normal.
Well, I mean, it's been really remarkable to observe, as someone that's spent their career in Silicon Valley, to observe all of these companies that had never embraced these types of tools before, all of a sudden, figuring out, how do I show up in a video meeting? And I remember back in 2003 working at Cisco when bird flu happened, SARS, and that was right around the time that Cisco bought WebEx, and immediately the company got very comfortable with with video communications and working from home, and that was really kind of optional if you came into the office. And then fast forward, 5 years to the 2008 economic recession, Cisco took, $150 million of travel off the budget, but then invested like 75 million of it back into infrastructure to roll out telepresence systems in every office and made it available ubiquitously to every employee. Whereas before it was reserved for executives, now any employee could go online and book a telepresence room. And so the combination and integration of WebEx with telepresence meant that the geographic boundaries between people just evaporated. And normally, a CEO like John Chambers would have to get on a plane to see one or maybe two customers a day. Now he was seeing like 8 or 10 customers in a day. It was a total game changer. And that was a decade ago. More.
I remember once. So you had these telepresence centers, and at that time I was doing a bunch of work with you with a firm. I remember once walking into a telepresence center, and John was walking out. And I said, "Hi, John. What you been doing?" He said, "I just went around the world." And I think what we're discovering today is actually distance is a barrier. Time zones, on the other hand, I just sat in the last couple of days on a quarterly business review for a global company. And there were literally people on that quarterly review from every time zone, well, every major time zone sector. And that review went 9 hours. And I'm thinking, oh boy, I hope next year, next time you do it, you do 9 hours of India time and then 9 hours of France time, because if it's always 9 hours of Arizona time or America time, it's like that's not fair.
It's not fair, and that's culturally, I think that's definitely something that's been emerging, is this idea that there is no center of the world. No matter what time zone you're in, or no matter what time of day it is, there's always someone that is going to be up and willing to engage with you in a meeting or on text or on email. And it really forces you to create boundaries, hard boundaries about when you're working and when you're not. But also being obviously respectful to people around the world so that they can have.
By the way, how is, you're touching something that every single conversation I'm having with companies has come up. I'd love to hear how it's working at Intel, which is, how do you create the boundary between work time and personal time in this world where, as you point out, we can be virtually available 24/7?
We coach our employees to just set the boundaries. I mean, everyone has their own personal responsibilities. Some people, especially now with the pandemic, you might have two parents at home with their kids, and they need to adjust their work hours. And so they'll shift work left or right in order to support periods of time where they can be with the family. And they just block that out. Other people are just, forcing their routine and communicating. If you work in a close team, understanding the constraints of other people. So if I know that, one of my colleagues needs to, be with her son every day from 12 to 2, I know not to put pressure on her to feel obligated to be available. And we just manage that as a team dynamic. But I wouldn't say anyone's figured it out yet.
It's so, I think, so there's kind of the obvious times of blocks. The thing I worry about is people who basically at the margin, have time, but at some point they've given away all of their free time, and they you get this sort of Zoom fatigue thing that's and it affects your creativity, affects your just your value add. So I think it is important for people to get a new sort of Zoom discipline. It's just another form of self-discipline, but it's one that we need to internalize.
Well, I'd be curious, from your point of view, now that these kind of geographic barriers are somewhat removed, how is that going to impact the way companies develop products?
It's so funny. I remember, actually, you and I both know a guy named Pete Solvik, who was the CIO at Cisco back in the day. And I remember when Pete said to me, he said, the next major system that we roll out, we're going to develop and roll it out in Europe. Because he felt this sort of huge sort of Silicon Valley sort of gravitational thing. So I think it's really important. And by the way, it's already showing up. It's clear that China on mobile is way ahead of us. I mean, just miles ahead of us. And isn't it fun to watch Korea with gaming or even hip hop, right? I mean, and you start going around the world and you start saying, and I think part of it is the world's got to be able to capture some of the venture risk taking capability that America that was kind of our strong suit. Because one of the things I worry about is there's this enormous creativity in Europe right now, for example, but their cultures are not set up to take venture risk. I mean, they're trying to either fund it through the government. That's not the right way to do it. Or they do have a venture community, but it's kind of modest and anyway, I just think we need to become more global because the problems are more global and the talent is global. Particularly as we get to data science and machine learning, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of data scientists and machine learners that aren't in the United States, and we need to be able to leverage that as global corporations.
Yeah, it really raises, I think, a lot of questions about, how do you get access to the market sensing capabilities you need if you want to develop a product for global consumption. And in the development of that, how do you ensure that you're incorporating, a diverse set of requirements so that you're building products that, are inclusive and that you ensure that they don't have any implied bias in their development and all of those types of things.
I want to ask you a minute about smart cities, but I really want to double underscore something you just said. We've been talking about diversity forever, right? And by and large, we're starting to kind of make a dent in gender diversity, but frankly, in tech, not particularly brilliantly. And outside of gender diversity, there's ethnic diversity from the point of view that the ethnicity of a tech person doesn't matter, but the fact that they're a tech person is a kind of demographic that does matter. And we are so undiverse in our industry. And at a time when you were just kind of that special ingredient that was sort of in the back office or buried in a car or in an airplane or a rocket ship, okay, it's a bunch of nerds, let them go. The problem now is that the digital transformation, everything's becoming digital, which means digital products. And we're seeing this. Mr. Zuckerberg at Facebook is learning more about this than he wanted to know. And Mr. Dorsey at Twitter is learning more about this than he ever wanted to know. And we're realizing that there are social implications to technology that are just far, and the whole thing with George Floyd and what's going on in our society right now, it's just painfully obvious that we thought we were a lot more inclusive than we really were. We're nowhere close. And as you point out, that means we're going to design things in good faith. I mean, Facebook was designed in good faith, but the world's moved on, and the world has diverse needs and makes diverse attacks as well as diverse demands. So we've been pretty sheltered in Silicon Valley. We're gonna have to step up that inclusion game big time. And our management methods, our engineers, we never trained for this, right? I mean, best engineers became the next best manager, right? Or best salespeople became the next best salesperson. So we got a lot to learn. We really do.
For sure. And I think, while you're on the topic, if this feels different, what we're experiencing right now, perhaps it's because of the vulnerability that we all feel. Perhaps it's because there's so much fragility because we, for 15, 18 weeks, have been really humbled. And we've seen this incredible outpouring of humanity as a result of the pandemic. And then to have that contrast with this just horrible, racism here domestically in the United States, I think it feels to me like that there's an opportunity to really break through. And it's been amazing to see the way, certain leaders have, stepped up and have allowed themselves to be, vulnerable, have made decisions without waiting for it to be popular or reacting. And there's, just from the corporate point of view, stepping across that line of taking a political and social and position on humanity. I'm deeply hopeful that this, we can actually make a difference now and start changing some of the systems that are deeply rooted so that we can avoid those problems that you're bringing up.
Look, the problems. Look, the problems. I mean, the problems have always been there. There's an argument to say actually human life has never been better than it is in the present. And from some points of view, you can say, well, life expectancy. There's lots of things to say. Okay, look, we've been dealt a pretty good hand from that point of view. But as we're discussing here, there are endemic forces in the human condition. I don't know if they can ever be removed, but they certainly can be better remediated and better acknowledged and better, which we can take a much more proactive approach to them. What's interesting to me is the leadership now is coming, at least in the United States, is coming as much from the business community, if not more, than ever before. And historically, you would have said, well, government would have led. For whatever the circumstances in our country aren't conducive to that right now. So, but even if they were, I still think business leadership is becoming increasingly important. And I began to realize, we have these two words in our vocabulary for business. We have this word called leader, and we have this word called manager. And I think in business schools, managers are kind of taken for granted. They're kind of like, well, manager, blah, blah, blah. But leaders are celebrated. What I've learned, of course, I look at everything through this technology adoption lifecycle lens. So, if I have a hammer, you will be a nail. But through that lens, what you realize is when things are not being disrupted, and for most of the time in most sectors of the economy, things are evolutionary, not revolutionary. Management is key. And leadership is not as important because basically you're on kind of it's like driving the Indianapolis 500 race. It's an oval, people. Come on, get around the oval faster and faster and faster. But disruption's more like a Formula One GP race where it's like, oh, watch out for the corkscrew and the chicane and the this and the that. And so that's when you need leadership. And leadership really, you said it, leadership is the ability to act before it's popular and actually before you have enough facts to really be sure you're doing the right thing. Management, on the other hand, is saying be data-driven, measure twice, cut once, be smart. So there's a yin-yang here that we have to honor.
Yeah, so basically, in other words, manager's job is to mitigate risk, and a leader's job is to take calculated risk.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
There was an interesting, not to get too political, but there was an interesting piece, an op-ed in the New York Times about a week ago from David Brooks, who I'll paraphrase what he said, but it was basically that, in times of crisis, leaders are those that step out of their role and reveal themselves uncloaked and humbled, decisive and bracingly honest about reality, and that it's the hard times themselves that are the making of character, revelation of character, and a test of character. And that I think this pandemic and this, racial issue that we have here in the U.S. Has exposed some true leadership. It's all around us, and it's, to me, it's like you talk about leaders versus managers, and right now I feel like it's to be a leader is you have to be human.
Yeah. And by the way, it's not them that have to be leaders. It's us that have to be leaders. You, me, our families. And again, so in our own lives, there's the management vector and the leadership vector. There's a lot of time in life where basically, you got to go back to work on Monday and you get to have the weekends off and take care of yourself and invest in your career and try to do right by your customer and build better product or whatever. And your career builds on itself. There's a ton of management that's going on. But when we have these existential moments and the pandemic fueled by the racial crises and the rioting and whatnot, they're wake-up calls. They're wake-up calls that say, you know what, first of all, this movie has an ending. You are not here forever. So what are you going to do about life while you're here? So that kind of a little bit of that sort of existential awakening. And there's also awakening that says during the management phase, it feels like, well, everything's working. Really, everything's fine. Everything's fine. And then they disrupt. It's like, well, actually, no, it wasn't fine. And so you have to sort of, and particularly for those of us probably on this Zoomcast, and, we've got life pretty good compared to a whole lot of other people on the planet. And the notion that we can kind of just coast along and take that for granted, I think the pandemic, if nothing else, has sort of said, well, yeah, or you could stay home for 12 weeks and stay alive. I think the pandemic's been really a good wake up call for me personally. But I think actually these current political events are a deeper wake up call, because again, I tend to take for granted a bunch of things that most people just, or at least a whole lot of people, experience the world very differently and get treated very differently, and are playing a very different hand than the hand I'm playing.
Yeah, one of the things that's been amazing to watch is, I always say, this is something I picked up from John Chambers, you focus on what you can control or influence, and, everything else is wasted calories. And what's been interesting during this time over the last several months is that I've seen people redefine what is in their control or influence. And, I see it in my own company, where people are no longer asking for permission to do things. They're just going, they know what the right thing is, and they'll just go and they'll do it. Especially if it means, helping one of our customers get access to technology faster, or it's leveraging a system or tool or process we have on behalf of, an employee or a customer, in order to be able to, deliver supplies to the healthcare supply chain or what have you. I mean, there's 1,000 stories. And just to close on that leadership topic, I think it was Andy Grove that said there's two types of CEOs. There's the peacetime CEO, and then there's the wartime CEO. And very few have the ability to traverse, right? Because like you said, when things are going well, it's easy to, if you want to be a leader, you find a parade, you run to the front. But when times are hard, it's a totally different persona. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another dimension to that, which is internally focused versus externally focused. So in relatively good times, we tend to start optimizing our internals in order to get the best possible yield for our investors, for our employees. It doesn't have to be just for investors. It could be for stakeholders, it could be for customers. But basically what you do is you focus on your internal in order to get better at doing the Toyota production methodology, that kind of thing. When things get disrupted, the problem is you go from doing things right to are we doing the right things, right? So that's that switch in perspective. And I think what companies, and most important thing that companies can do this year, is when that happens, you have to take your focus outside of your internals. Stop looking at your spreadsheets and look out into the world and attach you to one. And I think there are two vectors that you can attach to. Most of the companies I work with have what I call a collaboration culture. And they are best served by attaching to what is the customer, what's changed in the customer's world. Forget about ourselves. What's changed in their world, and then work backward from a sort of design thinking point of view of, okay, so how does that connect back up to what we do? And how do I build a new connection to the world through new products or new services, or maybe just repositioning existing products and services, but I'm navigating by the customer. I'm not navigating by my quarterly plan. I'm not navigating by my career plan, and I'm not trying to kiss up to my boss. That's path one. The other path, which I don't personally spend as much time in these cultures because it's not a very good fit for me personally. There's another way to reorient your company, which is around competitors. And what you do there is you just say, look, those guys are going to crush us if we don't respond here. And you use the disruption to back to your first point, to accelerate your own company's competitive response, because again, they're kind of pragmatists in pain that you're putting them under pressure. But in either case, you're focusing outside of yourself. You're not focusing on yourself, because the worst thing you can do in a crisis is kind of go internal and sort of, look for a cocoon.
Oh, so I'm going to bring it back to Zone to Win, because we're in the middle of this right now, and Zone to Win has been a very powerful portfolio management tool. You mentioned it, ironically, in that video from 10 years ago, but that was before you wrote the book. I'm almost certain.
Oh yeah.
That was 2010. I don't think you had written Zone to Win in 2010. So you were already talking about this idea of incubation and transformation at that time. And what's been really interesting is this idea of, you're coming into an economic event, and you don't know how long it's, how deep it's going to be or how protracted it's going to be. And, to use a race car, you're talking about competitors and, just use a race car metaphor, you've got this turn coming up and you don't know how fast it's coming and you don't know how sharp it is and how long it is. And it seems like there's going to be different types of responses in terms of how companies are going to deal with this. Some are going to slam on the brakes, and they're going to lose all their momentum, and maybe they're going to be, cutting costs and laying off people and shutting down their R&D. And when this thing's over, they're going to have a hard time getting off that inertia and getting momentum again. They're going to have to bring in more people and rebuild their brain trust, and that's going to be a disaster for them. Some are going to perhaps underestimate, and they're going to slam on the brakes too late, and they're going to spin out or they're going to crash. And then there's some that maybe are a bit more adept that will tap on the brakes of spend, continue to focus on their strategy because it was the right strategy before the crisis. It's the right strategy now, but they just have to navigate this short to medium term economic event. And then they'll slow down, they'll tap the brakes. But then when they see the way out of the turn, they'll accelerate and they'll have escape velocity. And I think, so while it's not a competitive mindset, it will give them a competitive advantage. And if they are also using this as a time to not only stay the course, but to also, maybe double down and do some acquisitions and some other things. And this is, we see this in our own business. We in the productivity zone, this is where we're trying to keep our costs as low as possible right now. But the transformation zone, we continue to fund and hire because, you have to if you want to win long term.
When you get in the difference between the incubation zone and the transformation zone is important for people to realize. In the incubation zone, failure is still an option. In fact, fast failure is in a funny way, it's almost success mode because you. But
don't you think like most companies are that's the first place they're going to look if they need to cut costs in a time like this? They're going to kill the incubation zone.
And that's the reason why that's a mistake is, first of all, it's not very expensive. So yeah, you can kill it, but you don't save very much money. And second of all, you talked about market sensing, and particularly in this century where the power is shifted away from the supply chain and much more to the customer side of the equation. Now we'll see what happens after this COVID thing, but prior to COVID, for sure, the power had gone hugely to the customer, which means the reason you needed an incubation zone was less and less because you needed to invent some product that some other genius hadn't invented, and more of trying to figure out how is digital transformation going to be absorbed by the world, and how do we need to change our alignment with our products and services to connect with that world. So the incubation zone is all about product market fit, and so that's that fast failure place. You said transformation, so I want to make this really important point. When you go to the transformation zone, this is when you're kind of putting all your chips in the middle of the table. So failure is not an option in the transformation zone. And so what that means is, once you start, you can't slow down, because if you start a transformation and then take your foot off the gas and you slow down, you can never get it. You can never get the momentum back. It just never comes back. So first of all, that should make you very thoughtful about, are we prepared to go through a transformation? Because if you're not, you mustn't start. But if you do, then it's like all hands have to align around the transformation. And the good news in that is, if they do, and particularly if that transformation is in service to your customers, who will help you pull you through that turn, you will get through it. Transformations are only hard when we internally resist them. But the fact is, we do internally resist them because they take resources away from our core businesses at a time when our core businesses are going, you can't do that. And so we get these political infights around the budget and resource allocation and who's supporting whom and da-da-da-da-da. And that's the stuff that creates the death of companies. And as you know, at the beginning of Zone to Win, I list 56 iconic tech companies that either don't exist anymore or in some business that they never ever wanted to be in. So that notion then of that two-parter. Right now, it's really important that people not abandon incubation because they've got to reconnect to their market. You can do that to some degree by repurposing your performance zone. You can say, hey guys, don't worry so much this quarter and next quarter about making quota. Connect with our customers, reconnect with our customers. Let's reduce churn if we don't actually get a lot of new sales. And by the way, what are they worried about? And how can we help? And how can we adjust our offers to be more successful in the future? You can do a lot of work without having to have a transformation. But what you can't do is hunker down and just say, it's all about our spreadsheets. We've replanned, but we got to make our plan. We got to make our plan. We got to make our plan. Not during a disruption. That's not the most important thing.
So it's interesting because when you started your career, you were basically helping portfolio companies of venture capitalists who were trying to get a single product or offer across the chasm, and that kind of informed your research. And now, you've kind of indexed towards, okay, now you're an established company. You've got very large and mature lines of business and revenue streams, and now it's about how do you create the next new thing and incubate something that can be 10% or more of your business. But the VC mindset is still very prevalent in your philosophy.
So here's what it's so interesting. So because as you point out, as a startup, startups are hard. There's challenges for sure. But if you get funded as a startup, you don't have any conflicts about how you're going to use the money. You only have one place to put the money, right? You're going from you're being incubated. Your transformation is actually crossing the chasm. And when you go public, that's probably when you have a performance zone and a productivity zone. And that's great. But when you try to do it the second time, there's no venture capital. So now all of a sudden you're going to take your performance numbers down, and it has to come out of your own working capital and cash flow or debt or whatever. And it's like, well, wait a minute. I just built that. I don't want to disassemble it, right? So there's an enormous amount of internal conflict. So what we've learned from the venture capital community there is two things. One is don't try to emulate their financial model because you can't have 25 companies and have if 5 succeed. You don't have that kind of fund, right? We don't have a venture fund, but do emulate their management model. So what the thing that large corporations have been so bad at, they used to remember that had labs, Bell Labs, Nokia Labs, HP Labs, IBM Labs, Xerox PARC. The thing they were so good at was inventing, but they were horrible at holding themselves accountable to getting to building businesses. And this is back to John Chambers and that conversation we had 10 years ago about the emerging technology group, where John said, I can't do anything with a $10 million business. I can take a $100 million business to $1 billion, but I need something inside of Cisco to get it from 10 to 100. Well, that was the first incubation zone that I ever worked on. And the key idea there is we managed it but to venture capital operating model, meaning you got funded to milestones by a certain date. If you didn't get to the milestone by a certain date, you weren't entitled to get more funding. And that really did change the game and held everybody accountable. So it was an accountability model for innovation and incubation that had not existed before.
So I have so many questions about this. So, you talk about, it's easy to get to 10 million or even 50 million in revenue, but then to get it to 100 and then to scale it to $1 billion. I mean, it takes a long time to do that and a lot of discipline. And if there's not a lot of examples of either companies or products that have gone from 0 to $1 billion in less than 5 years that I can think of. Even the iPhone, if you consider the entire product development process leading up to the launch, I believe it was over 7 years before it got to $1 billion in revenue. So what are your thoughts on like just the life cycle duration and incubation gestation periods?
Yeah, I think there's two things. So I think first of all, however long it incubates, that's fine. The incubation zone is not, as I said, it's not expensive to fund. If the technology is going to take longer, it's going to take longer. That's fine. But the transformation you really have about 2 years to get through what we call the J curve. I mean, going between things getting uglier to things getting prettier. And at a given size, after you're bigger than say $1 billion or maybe $2 billion at the least, you can't do it organically. You can't get there. You can't get to scale in time. So what the best practices I think increasingly have become: start organically, build something in the incubation zone. In a large corporation, you can actually get pretty close to $100 million in the incubation zone. That's fine. But then you're probably going to have to do an acquisition. The example that you and I know very well from Cisco was they acquired Tandberg for telepresence. The one I talk about from Salesforce is they had Buddy Media and they had Radian 6, but they acquired ExactTarget, and that was their big marketing cloud play. Now the case of the Microsoft Azure one, I don't think there was a lot of acquisition. I think they had a huge war chest, and they were very patient with that business, and they were under existential threat. So when you're under existential threat, you're willing to make more sacrifices than you are if you're just doing it sort of for competitive advantage. So I do think that the zone management issues they're prevalent, and they're challenging because you have genuinely legitimate interests in each zone, and they're in conflict with each other. And I think we need to just make sure that we honor those conflicts and then manage through them, as opposed to have one zone try to suppress or override another zone. Because that's what tends to happen. Each zone tries to say, well, the other guys are crazy and I'm the one who's right. And that doesn't work.
Well, that's the thing that I think is so, interesting about, people always end up taking a parochial view, like, oh, if I'm running a mature, profitable business, why would I want to give that profit to funding somebody else's incubation that may or may not ever yield anything? I'd rather invest it in my own stuff. And, just getting to a mindset where actually, there's 4 zones, and all 4 zones are players on the same team. We're all wearing the same jersey, and you actually need to pass the ball from zone to zone. And the ball is resources, it's money, it's people, et cetera. And, the companies that will master that process, I think, are going to be incredibly successful.
Yeah, I think the ball is actually prioritization. I think as Mark Benioff taught me the phrase, we were doing Zone to Win. He said, Geoffrey, what we're facing is a crisis of prioritization. And I think that's real. I think that's true in almost every company, because the issues are legitimate, they're not fraudulent. The guy does want more money to do his mature business, and we do have to catch the next wave of technology, and we don't know yet what to do. I mean, every zone's got their own, and the productivity zone is saying, we're spending way too much money. We should be able to cut costs here and here and here. Those are all legitimate priorities. So then the issue is, but if we don't solve for the crisis of prioritization, if we just let the prioritization forces entangle with each other, then you get that horrible thing in large corporations, which is we're so slow. We don't innovate around here, blah, 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 blah. And the answer is, well, yeah, because you've kind of tangled yourself up in a crisis of prioritization.
Yeah. And what happens is, and, I've seen this before where, we used to call it the carrot farm, right? Where the incubation activities were all carrots. And because we were so anxious to see something get to scale, you pull the carrot out like every day looking to see if it's grown. And it's like, you got to let it just chill.
Open the egg. Why didn't the chick hatch? We'll put the egg back together. We'll see how it is tomorrow.
Yeah. So, there is there's some cultural differences between the zones. There's metrics and all these things. And, I think it's been a tremendously powerful framework, that I've seen in action. And, if I can bring the conversation back to a couple things that are going on in terms of just, the world we live in and how these changes that we've been forced into over the last couple of months are going to impact our life, yours, mine, and everyone else on the planet. And I think about the 2 quotes. One is William Gibson when he talks about the future is here; it's just not evenly distributed. And I think about China being kind of a lens into the future, right? They've dealt with, these types of things before. They have, cameras ubiquitously around all their urban environments that are looking for people with temperature, that are helping to keep their communities safe. And, I'm sure you've spent lots of time across Asia and China, and, you don't need to touch things physically. There's a lot of automation, and we haven't really absorbed a lot of those, technologies and how they'll change our behavior. And I guess the other quote that I have, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this stuff, is Roy Amara, who says, we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run, but underestimate the effect of a technology in the long run. And so I'm curious your point of view on like all of these things that the technologies already exist, like remote healthcare. It's been around for 20 years, but now we've had in the last 3 months more progress in telemedicine than we have in the last decade. Camera technology and automation and all these things. What are your thoughts on all of that?
There's so many interesting kind of subtopics, because I know you've done a bunch of work with smart cities, and let's start there, because you and I had a good conversation yesterday about a phrase that you use, which I'm now going to incorporate into my vocabulary, called value exchange. But
I'm so glad you're saying this on a public podcast so that I get some.
Hey, no, but it's true. So I mean, because the conversation, as you recall, was around privacy, civil rights, the ACLU, all the kind of things that people worry about. What's happening to my data? Will the government use this data? Will insurance people use this data to discriminate? Racial discrimination. I mean, just redlining in real estate. I mean, all there's a whole set of totally legitimate either anxieties, fears, or just genuine concerns that are on one side. And then to your point, what this can do for health and safety, for helping for better police protection, for better traffic control, for better pollution control, for better education. It's obvious that there are these two sort of piles of concerns and possibilities in there. And I think, and historically, what Silicon Valley did was it took a very libertarian approach. It said, use it or not, it's up to you. We make the best stuff. It's not our problem. I don't think we can do that anymore. I think you're back to your issue about inclusiveness and designing products for the world. We have to understand that increasingly the social engineering of our capabilities are an increasingly large proportion of the total value proposition, and we can no longer afford to say, well, that's not our problem. We just do electrons. We don't do atoms. We'll just worry about bits. I don't think we get to do that anymore. But it is going to create. I mean, it creates enormous complexity, as you know. And I think what it does, however, do, and does play to our strengths, is we're good at innovation if we frame the problem correctly. My whole life has just been all I've tried to do my whole life in business is try to help people frame the problem correctly so that they can apply innovation to solve it. And when you misframe a problem, you actually make it worse. Not your efforts to make it better actually make it worse. So I think that's a big part of the of this value exchange. And I think the reason I'm going to hold on the phrase value exchange is because that gets that notion of what are you willing to trade for what? Let's do it consciously. But you don't get anything for free.
Well, yeah. Well, there's going to have to be some. Yeah, I think in some scenarios there's going to be a choice, like in healthcare, and I think in other scenarios, like in a smart city, you may not have a choice. So just to double click on those, in healthcare, let's say you have an X-ray or an MRI of a part of your body, and today you have a choice. You can have your primary care physician who you know and trust look at that image, and based on their own knowledge set, they're going to give you a diagnosis. And that will limit your privacy, right? To one person. But it also limits the value that you're going to get from that diagnosis because it's based on a single person looking at that image, and maybe they haven't seen this case before. So another option could be is you could give up a little bit of privacy. In exchange, that image could be uploaded to a PACS system where 100 radiologists from all over the world that have a much broader set of experiences will give you a diagnosis. Or even today, you could let AI take a look at that image, combined with other demographic information about who you are as an individual, and combine that into a population health analysis that is not only going to give you a much higher accuracy of diagnosis, but it's going to be personalized to you based on all of these other factors. But I think you're going to have that choice, right? Of how much are you willing to give up in order to get a more accurate diagnosis? Whereas in a smart city, I mean, the contrast between where we live in California and Shanghai, China. Here in California, San Francisco has outlawed facial recognition. The state of California has outlawed body-worn cameras with facial recognition technology. And yet in China, cameras are everywhere. There was a great New York Times article about a year ago. One of the articles, one of the authors, one of the reporters stationed locally there, counted 100 cameras during their 12-minute commute to their office. And those cameras are capturing all kinds of information, but they're keeping people safe. And looking for temperature, looking for suspicious behavior, even from a traffic management point of view. It's been proven that you put cameras in an intersection and you reduce traffic accidents. I mean, there's so many obvious benefits to a city environment, but that's not an opt-in, opt-out scenario. Everyone's got to participate.
Sure. That's a social contract issue. And I mean, if you think about the history of China over the last 100 years, it went from, essentially a feudal economy through a communist revolution, a dictatorship of the proletariat, some really grisly, grim demographic death statistics, a whole lot of stuff. By the way, it's now emerged as pretty clearly going to be the number one economy of the 21st century, because domestic economies are what creates global economies. I mean, in the 20th century, everybody had to come to the United States because we were the biggest growth economy in the world, and that's where you made your money. China's going to be the biggest growth economy in the 21st. I'm not sure that China's going to be as open to having people come in and make money with them, however, so that's going to be its own issue. But my point is that China has a social contract, and you're seeing it right now with Hong Kong, and you're seeing it right now with Taiwan, that this social contract is not universal, and it's not universally accepted, and there's anxiety. So I think what I would, if I were to listen to the safety thing you said, and I lived in Taiwan or Hong Kong, I might say, well, Jonathan, you're being naive here. These people are going to use this to suppress dissent. They're going to use it to blah, 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 whatever. And God knows human beings have done a lot worse than that. So it's not stupid to be concerned about it. But it's back to value exchange. And it's back to some level of the social contract of how much are we willing to entrust with government, and even inside the United States, how much am I willing to entrust to a police force versus how much is a Black person willing to entrust to police forces? Those are two different perspectives on what is supposedly the same police force, but it isn't the same police force. And so I think there's again, it's back to that issue of our sector, the libertarian point of view of saying, this is not our problem. This is society's problem. This is government's problem. This is I don't think we get to say that anymore. These are real problems. They do not have easy answers. I do think we can innovate. So I do think we can start saying, well, how can we produce the benefits without creating the liabilities? And I think there's going to be huge pressure on tech to do that. And through anonymization. I mean, there's all kinds of techniques that you did. But you guys, you've been in the middle of smart cities, right? I mean, were you involved in any of these smart cities with Intel? You and your team?
Yeah, we've been doing, whether it's at Intel or Cisco, GE. I mean, yeah. And the implementation changes based on the city. I mean, you look at a city like Portland, and what they're using cameras at intersections to do is reduce pedestrian and bicycle accidents. And they've proven over the last couple of years that they've had a huge decrease. Not because they're monitoring the intersection and they can see what happens, but based on the data, they can understand the traffic patterns better, and it allows them to reprogram the lights and the traffic signals and know when they need to have crosswalks. And it's just been a way to get more data to improve urban design, right? In San Diego, they have deployed systems that have had an impact on crime in the gas lamp district, and then in other parts of the world, Singapore, Toronto, Canary Wharf in London. I mean, everyone has a unique implementation, and it all depends on the politics of the society. I mean, London was one of the early adopters because of so much terrorism during the 80s and 90s that they put cameras everywhere. And it's just, people have accepted that that's just the way it is, and they feel safe because of it. What started out as being able to identify, an act of terror and then be able to find that person. Now they have the ability, because the technology is IP based and is networked, and there's computer vision algorithms. They now have the ability to identify a known character and be able to follow them around the entire city, if they need to do that. And it's not people that are following them; it's algorithms.
Yeah. I think we're back to value exchange. I can imagine some people watching this podcast going, that is exactly the right answer. And I can imagine other people of equally good faith saying that is a horrible answer. And so I think if we look at the next, because this is going to be the fabric of, we're going to make more impact on society with the digital fabric than anything else over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, it is so transformative for all the reasons that we've been saying for years and years. And to your point, because these disruptions, and healthcare disruptions, terrorism disruptions, crime disruptions being three, now with this whole racial injustice, that's a fourth. And by the way, body cams or mobile cameras, that's where these witness videos are coming from, right? There's a technology. You couldn't have done that 10 years ago. You couldn't have posted it on the internet and had these things happen. So
that's right.
We're changing we're kind of mutating as a species. We're going to becoming humanitas digitas or something like that. And so I think we have to just incorporate that into our design specs.
But this goes back to your comments on leadership, because the technology is evolving faster than our legislation and our political systems can keep up. And so it's the leadership of these technology companies that are figuring out what the rules can or should be. And in some cases they're well guided and intentioned, and in other cases they're torn between doing what's right and doing what's profitable. And it's a really interesting moral dilemma for companies that are at that intersection where they have to choose to really set some type of policy around technology that has never been something we've had to deal with before. I mean, this has been going on for a while now. You mentioned, the Facebook and Twitter stuff around freedom of information and speech, but I mean, all of these things around privacy, security,
who your customers are, Salesforce. So I think, by the way, one of the things I think, we're talking about this, frankly, as I want to break this to you gently, Jonathan, kind of old white men. I don't know. Just want to kind of break that. I've sort of decided I'm no longer a young man. It's been a stretch for me. But
own it. Just own it.
Yeah, whatever. But the point is, when you look at we use the word millennial, although that's no longer, I don't think, a very meaningful phrase, but just use it for the placeholder. The ethic of generations coming into the workforce is saying, purpose has to be part of my work compensation. I'm not just working for a paycheck. I didn't come out of a depression. I mean, my father worked for a paycheck, but
right. This is the Steve Jobs comment on the park bench in Central Park to John Scully. Do you want to make sugar water, or do you want to change the world?
Yeah. And increasingly these people, and not only that, they're saying, and we have a set of values that we want to hold our business leaders accountable to, which is kind of, that kind of caught a whole generation by surprise. But it's clearly now a clear and present, and I hope persistent and permanent part of our culture. That's going to help because if we start saying, look, we need to, the part of a company now is not just its balance sheet, not just its product portfolio, its customer base. It's also a tradition of values. And different companies can have different traditions of values.
And we've seen this. We've seen this, right, at Amazon and Google and Facebook. The walkouts, the protests, the moral conscience of the employees rising up, and in some cases that's changed a decision or a posture or a policy. In other cases, it hasn't. But I think you're right. I think, that's one of the beautiful things that gives me hope about the world that we live in, is that this generation that's coming up, has a moral compass, and they are, they are the future, and there's going to be this period of time where we've got the old guard, and the new guard, and we just need to accelerate that new guard coming into place with, with more diversity and with.
I think what it just says is it's just another signal and another force that says we need to take more holistic accountability for the impact of our industry on the planet. And we need to build it into our design rules. It's back to, and it goes back to the whole thing about inclusion and diversity we were talking about right at the beginning. The danger of us having lacking in diversity in our companies is that we are going to design narrow-minded offers for a broad-minded world, and the world they'll do what they can with them, but man, we're missing the boat, and then eventually the world will come back and hold us accountable, and they'll say, well, you just can't do that. But you're going to be
and there needs to be more transparency. Companies need to state what their policy is on ethics, and make that public. And it needs to be not just a statement, but it needs to be embedded in their policy. And they need to be transparent about the diversity of their workforce and where their investments and donations go. And, this eventually can get incorporated into, to some degree, regulations around data and privacy.
I think there's a leadership phase of this, and then there's a management phase of this. I think we're probably still in the leadership phase, but I'm watching, like I saw the letters from the CEO that leak out. I think are really interesting. There was one yesterday, I think, from Dana, the new guy at Uber, who is writing kind of a heartfelt thing about an Uber situation. And when Airbnb had to do layoffs, Brian Chesky's letter was out. And Mark Benioff has this once a week all hands thing that it's not for the public, but it's all the sales force. But in all of those three cases, you're watching people model. It's not just that they've asserted that this is the rule. It's not just that this is not just a governance model. It's an inspirational and aspirational point of view that I think people rally to. And I think particularly in times of crisis, we need to be inspired and rally. And because we're front and center, because the tech sector, if you look at the stock market, the tech sector and the NASDAQ's actually being very, very optimistically treated right now. I think because we have this very privileged position, but we can't, with privilege comes responsibility.
Indeed. Hey, Jeff, this has been an amazing conversation. And I'm just, as always, you and I never run out of things to talk about. And I am just very grateful for you and for everything that you've done to help, our industry just, think about how we can take better, faster, and responsible use of technology to, improve our own productivity and make the planet a better place. It's super fun, and I really appreciate it.
It's a privilege, and And I certainly, it's a privilege right now to be working with you at Intel. It was a privilege to be working at Cisco and Salesforce and Microsoft and all these places. So I feel very honored. And as long as I can be of service, I'll probably be out there working it.